OP claims this started as, like, one ordinary boundary, but the reaction made it look like everyone else thought they were still available on demand. So is a 17-year-old being cruel? Or did a family get way too comfortable extracting emotional labor?
Right, that is the core tension here.
Exactly. So today, we're doing a deep dive into a viral Reddit thread where a totally private family conflict turned into this massive public referendum on where care ends and where control begins. This all started on the subreddit, Am I Overreacting? And then eventually wrapped up on Best to Redditor updates.
Yeah, it's a fascinating case study.
It really is. And our mission today is to look at the mechanics of why a single moment of silence can completely threaten an entire family structure.
But before we dissect the architecture of this specific family, we really need to establish our framing, because everything we explore today is based entirely on the original posters or OP's unverified account.
Right, we only have one side.
Exactly. We are treating this strictly as, you know, what OP says or what OP claims. The other family members obviously cannot log on and share their side of the story here, so we are analyzing the situation and the internet's really intense reaction based entirely on the parameters that OP provided.
Which is important to keep in mind.
Oh, for sure. So, to bring you into this, have you ever set a boundary that you thought was incredibly simple, only to watch the people around you react as if you had, like, committed treason?
Oh, well. Yes.
Because that is exactly what we are exploring today. We are looking at the psychology of why that happened.
Yeah, and to understand why a seemingly simple boundary triggered such a massive shockwave, we have to look at the historical baseline OP was operating from. So according to the thread, OP is a 17-year-old minor.
Right, still a kid.
Still a kid, living with a 21-year-old older sister. And OP describes growing up in this remarkably messy household where the parents fought constantly. But the defining feature of this environment is the dad's long history of infidelity.
Which really sets the stage.
It does. OP claims the father cheated on their mom when OP was just 4 years old and the sister was 8. And then seemingly out of nowhere, he cheated again around 2021. And the way that second affair came to light is actually crucial.
How did they find out?
The 21-year-old sister actually discovered it by finding a text message on his phone.
Oh, wow. That timeline is devastating when you map it onto a child's cognitive development. I mean, if the first affair happened when OP was 4, that means OP has essentially spent their entire conscious life in a state of foundational instability.
Right, like they've never known anything else.
Exactly. In family systems theory, we look at how an environment of chronic betrayal forces children to adapt in these really unseen ways. They don't just witness the instability, you know. They absorb it and they try to manage it.
It makes me think of like a city's power grid.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah, so when the main generators, the parents in this case, fail to provide stable electricity, the system doesn't just shut down. The backup generators are forced to kick in to keep the lights on.
That's a really good way to put it.
And in this family, the kids are the backup generators. They are carrying the emotional load, they're managing the tension, and trying to power a household that they didn't even design. But a 17-year-old simply isn't wired to power a whole house. Eventually, the circuits are going to fry.
Right, they just burn out.
Yeah.
And that structural overload completely changes how a child perceives their own role in the family. When adults break the fundamental social contract of a home, which is, you know, safety and trust, children learn to monitor the emotional weather.
The emotional weather, yeah.
Yeah, they track the micro expressions on their parents' faces. They calculate the safest time to walk into a room. They learn that keeping the peace requires their silence. So they're essentially performing a massive amount of uncredited emotional labor just to maintain a facade of normalcy.
And what happens to their understanding of obligation? I mean, if you spend over a decade watching your father rewrite the rules of loyalty for himself while still expecting you to respect his authority, that has to completely warp a teenager's baseline for what they actually owe their parents.
Oh, absolutely. It creates this incredibly confusing psychological trap. The adult is basically demonstrating that the rules of fidelity and respect do not apply to him.
Right, he's above the rules.
Exactly. Yet, the child is still expected to adhere to a strict, traditional hierarchy of compliance. The implicit message is like, I am allowed to be reckless, but you are required to be resilient.
Wow, that's heavy.
It is. The child learns that their primary job is to absorb the shockwaves of the adult's poor decisions without making a fuss. Love and obligation become basically synonymous with swallowing your own discomfort.
And that expectation of silent compliance is exactly what made the grandmother's birthday party so explosive.
Right, the catalyst.
Yeah. So, according to OP's account, and this was actually heavily analyzed by a commenter named D Mercenary, the family was gathered for this milestone birthday, a classic high-pressure family event, right?
Always stressful.
Always. And OP claims the dad used this specific gathering to bring his affair child, who was referred to in the post as the kid, along to the party, officially disclosing the situation and introducing the child to the family right then and there.
He unilaterally decides to introduce a half-sibling born from an affair in the middle of a grandmother's birthday celebration.
It is a staggering choice of venue. It really is. And OP's reaction to this bomb dropping was to simply refuse to look at their dad.
That was it.
That was it. OP didn't scream, they didn't storm out or like flip the buffet table. They just withdrew their gaze entirely. But I mean, I get why OP snapped, I really do. But playing devil's advocate here, drawing this line in the middle of Grandma's birthday party.
Yeah, the timing is interesting.
Right. That feels timed specifically to cause maximum awkwardness. Like, why choose the most public, vulnerable moment to execute this boundary?
Well, let's look at the mechanics of why the dad chose that venue in the first place, right? Dropping catastrophic news at a major family gathering is a well-documented tactic.
Right.
Oh, yeah. When a parent demands family unity to cushion their own bad behavior, they are relying on social convention to act as a human shield. If he tells the family in the living room on a rando Tuesday, they have the freedom to yell, to cry, to leave.
Right, they can react normally.
Exactly. But if he tells them at Grandma's birthday party, they are socially hostaged. The pressure of the event forces them to smile, pass the cake, and pretend everything is fine.
So he is weaponizing manners.
Yes, weaponizing manners.
He is betting that their fear of ruining the grandmother's birthday will override their anger at his betrayal.
Precisely. And that brings us to the mechanics of OP's reaction. We really need to distinguish between a boundary and a punishment here.
Okay, how so?
Well, a punishment is an active measure taken to inflict pain or teach someone a lesson. A boundary is simply a perimeter you establish to protect your own psychological space. OP is 17 years old. They have zero financial leverage.
Right, they can't just move out.
Exactly. They cannot kick their dad out of the house. They do not control the guest list. The only asset OP truly owns in that exact second is their own attention.
So withholding eye contact is the only currency they have left to spend.
Exactly. Eye contact is one of our primary vehicles for social mirroring and validation. When the dad brings the affair child into the room, he isn't just asking for physical space, he is demanding psychological validation.
He wants them to approve.
Yes, he wants his family to look at him, look at the child, and signal that this new reality is acceptable. By refusing to look at him, OP is denying him that absolution. OP is rendering him socially invisible in that specific dynamic.
Wow.
It is the most minimal, peaceful form of self-protection available to a minor who is basically cornered in a public space.
But the family did not see it as peaceful self-protection. The fact that OP had to post on a forum called Am I Overreacting tells us that the pushback from the people around them was immense.
Oh, absolutely.
OP frames the family's reaction as demanding a level of access and obedience that OP fundamentally rejects. The family wanted OP to instantly accommodate this entirely altered reality.
And this is the core tension in almost every major family estrangement scenario. The severe pressure rarely comes from the initial wrong. It comes from the subsequent demand to move on as if the wrong never happened.
That makes total sense. It makes me think of playing a board game, like Monopoly. Imagine someone is the banker, and halfway through the game, you catch them blatantly stealing money from the bank.
Right, catching them red-handed.
Yeah, and instead of apologizing or putting the money back, they just shrug and say, yeah, I'm doing this now, it's my life. But then they demand that you keep rolling the dice.
Right, they want to keep playing.
Exactly. They demand you keep paying them rent when you land on their properties, and they expect you to keep pretending the game is fair. And when you finally fold your arms and refuse to roll the dice, they accuse you of ruining the game night.
That captures the dynamic perfectly because it highlights the absurdity of the expectation. The rules of the social contract were completely rewritten by the father, but the children are being billed for the emotional tax.
That is exactly it.
And what makes these conflicts so sticky is how both sides weaponize the language of care. The relatives and the dad, they frame accepting this new child as taking the high road, or being loyal to the family, or choosing peace.
But they're asking OP to choose the family's peace at the expense of OP's own internal peace.
Exactly, and that exposes a massive, pervasive double standard. There is an expectation placed on the minor to possess the emotional maturity, the grace, and the flexibility to smooth over a crisis that an adult entirely created.
Which is just wild when you think about it.
It really is. Think about the mechanics of that demand. The family system requires the teenager to perform intense emotional labor solely to manage the discomfort of the adult who betrayed them.
And the comment section on Reddit zeroed right in on that double standard. I mean, when you take a private family dispute and put it in front of thousands of strangers, you aren't just getting a verdict on the specific facts.
Right, it's bigger than that.
You're watching a jury decide which social rule matters more. Like, is it the preservation of the family hierarchy or the right to individual emotional safety?
The internet acted as a real-time mirror for these invisible power dynamics. So what themes actually emerged from that jury?
Well, the commenters weren't just angry at the dad, they were actively dismantling his defense.
Yeah.
Like, you had user Jikterkanda pointing out the blatant structural disrespect the father showed his kids.
Right.
But the really fascinating part was how they broke down the dad's justification. Like, user Hey Have a Great Day completely rejected the classic defense of, well, it's his life, he can do what he wants.
Because it's not just his life.
Exactly. They pointed out that while it is his life, his unilateral choices heavily and permanently impact the kids' lives. They don't exist in a vacuum.
Right. They are rejecting the idea that a parent's autonomy absolves them of their impact on the family system.
Exactly. And then you had users focusing on the teenager's right to simply exist. User KeyPickle5609 pointed out how bizarre it was that so many people in OP's real life were jumping all over a 17-year-old for having a very reasonable, minimal reaction.
Which is so true.
Yeah, and user Beach Polini noted that the dad was busy doting on the Acer child while completely ignoring the psychological damage he was inflicting on his older children.
Right, the contrast is stark.
It is. And then user Legs Johnson brought up a really great point about the mother, noting that they were glad the mom was sensible enough to remind everyone that smoothing this over is not the minor's responsibility.
That reaction from third-party observers is really telling. When we look at internet comment sections dealing with family trauma, commenters often project their own systemic anxieties onto the story. But here, the consensus was incredibly unified. They validated OP's right to have psychological boundaries.
But that brings up a really crucial question. If the internet overwhelmingly saw OP's silent treatment as a reasonable boundary, why did the people in OP's actual life, and even some of the very early commenters on the thread think OP was out of line?
Yeah, it's a disconnect.
It really is. Like, why is society, in the real world, so quick to jump on a teenager for protecting their peace instead of attacking the adult who blew up the peace in the first place?
Because a teenager successfully enforcing a boundary is terrifying to the status quo, society has a deep-seated, almost reflexive need to protect the institution of the family, often at the expense of the individuals trapped inside it.
Protect the family at all costs.
Exactly. In family psychology, we talk about the concept of boat rockers and boat steadiers.
Oh, I've heard of this.
Right, so the father, by having an affair and bringing the child to the party, is violently rocking the boat. The rest of the family has spent years learning how to balance the boat so it doesn't capsize. They are the boat steadiers.
And when OP refuses to look at the dad, OP is refusing to steady the boat anymore.
Exactly. And for the boat steadiers, OP's refusal is highly threatening. The family system attacks the person who points out the problem rather than the person causing it, because adapting to the problem is just easier than confronting the patriarch.
That is wild.
When relatives criticize OP, they aren't actually defending the dad's infidelity. They are defending the hierarchy. They are defending the foundational idea that parents are in charge and children must adapt to whatever reality the parents create.
Because if a 17-year-old is allowed to say no to their dad and refuse to participate in the illusion, then the whole power structure is vulnerable. Every other compromise the family has made suddenly looks like a choice rather than an obligation.
Exactly. And the internet jury validated OP because they recognized the core issue was leverage. The dad had the power to make the situation chaotic. He had the power to cheat, the power to keep a secret for years, and the power to introduce the affair child at a heavily populated social event.
He held all the cards.
He had all the cards. He is angry now because OP used their extremely limited power, their gaze, their attention to disengage. He expected an audience for his absolution, and OP simply closed the theater.
Closed the theater. I like that. And, you know, it is easy to judge a story about a secret affair child at a birthday party as something extreme, like something that happens to other people.
Right, something far away.
Yeah, but the same coercive pressure happens in ordinary ways all the time. It is the expectation to swallow your own discomfort just to keep the peace at a holiday dinner. It is the subtle pressure to pretend a past hurt didn't happen so a parent or a sibling can feel better about themselves without having to actually apologize.
Oh, absolutely. We all navigate those micro moments of forced compliance. And the unresolved tension in OP's story is something we all eventually have to grapple with when we start drawing our own lines.
Because it doesn't just magically fix things.
No, it doesn't. Even though OP won the Reddit vote, even though thousands of strangers validated their boundary, drawing a line in the sand doesn't magically fix the relationship.
The house with the cracked foundation still splintered.
Yes. It permanently alters it. The old rules no longer work, but the new rules haven't been written yet. OP cannot unknow what their dad did, and the dad cannot unsee OP's refusal to play along.
There is no going back.
Exactly. Setting a boundary is necessary for self-protection, but it rarely brings the kind of closure we hope for. It often just brings clarity about who the other person really is.
OP's boundary made everyone in that family realize that OP wasn't just a backup generator available on demand anymore. And that leaves us with something I want you to carry with you today.
It's a big question.
It is, if a relationship only functions because you never say no, who is really being protected by your silence? And what happens to you when you finally stop playing along?